Hello, welcome to this edition of Voices and Votes. I'm Zhou in Beijing. In our discussion today, we look at the challenges facing China's lawmakers and ways to improve the rule of law.
And I'm James Chow. China's top legislator delivers a work report saying China will improve the quality of its laws so they can be better implemented. But we begin this special program with the ongoing developments on the Malaysia Airlines plane. Still very few answers about the fate of Flight 370. The plane remains missing at this hour, almost 2 days after contact was lost with the commercial jetliner en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. A total of 239 people were on board at the time. Two-thirds of them were Chinese nationals. Now, the closest things to any kinds of clues that have been found so far are two major oil slicks. The Vietnamese Air Force reportedly spotted them 120 miles off its coast in the very same area where that flight is known to have disappeared from radar screens early on Saturday morning. No wreckage has been found around the oil slicks, but Malaysian authorities say that they're now extending that search and rescue operation.
We confirm that our search now has been extended to even wider areas, because there is the possibility, we are looking at the possibility of an aircraft air turnback, in which case different locations will have to be identified.
Meanwhile, reports have surfaced that two passengers on the missing flight used a pair of stolen passports to purchase their tickets at the same time. They were also booked on the same onward connecting flight on Saturday from Beijing that would have taken them on to Europe. The information follows reports that two of the passengers that were listed on the original manifest, one carrying an Italian passport, the other one an Australian passport, were not actually on the plane itself. They remain safe, but they both reportedly had their passports stolen in Thailand within the last 2 years.
There are only two passengers on record that have flown on this aircraft that has false passport, and we have the CCTV's recording of those passengers from check-in right to the departure point. And this record of the CCTVs are now being used for the investigation of this matter.
Well, when asked whether terrorism could be at the heart of this mystery, the Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Tun Razak said officials continue to look at all possibilities in front of them, but that it was too early to make any conclusions so far. Meanwhile, here in China and also in Malaysia, families of the passengers who were on board that flight continue to anxiously wait for any news of their loved ones. Relatives have gathered here in Beijing, mainly at the Lidu Hotel close to the airport, where frustration and anger grew with what they felt was a lack of news and information about what has happened from the airline itself. Well, a massive multinational rescue team continues its search for the missing flight MH370. China sent two of its naval warships and 5 rescue vessels carrying helicopters. 2 Chinese vessels are already searching waters where the MAS flight may have gone down. The other Chinese vessels are expected to arrive on Monday and Tuesday. Divers, medical teams and marines, along with rescue and underwater detection equipment, are being ferried to the search zone. Meanwhile, naval vessels from Malaysia and Vietnam are also searching for the plane. A Vietnamese Air Force plane reported spotting 2 major oil slicks in the same area on Saturday. 8 countries in all are involved in this massive hunt. We'll bring you more details on that developing story on flight MH370. Let's go now to the political season. China needs to further improve the quality of its legislation and also explore new ways of making it more scientific and democratic. Top lawmaker Zhang Dejiang made those comments as he gave a work report to the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. My colleague Han Bin has this story.
In the name of the Standing Committee of the NPC, Zhang Dejiang presented the work report for last year. He hailed the progress made on raising the quality of legislation.
At present, what the general public expects of our legislative work is that laws work well and are capable of solving practical problems. The Standing Committee has given higher priority to raising the quality of legislation and improving the mechanisms and methods of legislative work.
2013 has seen a number of key laws being passed or revised. For example, the air pollution in China has become a part of the national discourse. The NPC has revised the drafted amendment on environmental protection 3 times, but is still waiting to revise it for a 4th time this year to get an effective law. The system for re-education through labor has been abolished, and a remarkable adjustment has been made to the country's birth policies, allowing couples to have 2 children if one of the parents is an only child. And the Standing Committee also revised a package of laws to streamline administration and ensure that the market plays a decisive role. That resulted in the establishment of the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. Zhang Dejiang says the major task for this year is to strengthen legislation in key areas. A number of laws relating to these sectors are to be revised, including budget and administrative procedures.
The quality of legislative work directly affects how well the rule of law is implemented. The more we emphasize the rule of law, the more important it is to raise the quality of legislation.
Unlike the Western system of checks and balances between 3 branches and 2 chambers, the NPC alone is the highest body of state power in China. It turns the position of the CPC in China into the will of the state through legally defined procedures.
With China deepening its reforms in all fields, more laws are expected to be revised to help the government realize its goals. Chairman Zhang Dejiang's report sends a clear signal that the NPC Standing Committee will make the better use of the legal system so that legislation may play its full role in guiding and guaranteeing the reforms. Han Bin, CCTV, Beijing.
We have a team of reporters covering this story for us. One of them is Hona. She's over at the Great Hall of the People, from where she joins us now for this story. Hona, let's talk about the regulations and bills so often spoken about at the time of the political season. 2013 was no exception. Lots of bills passed then. Has there been any progress in the sense that have lives been enriched since that time? And what's been the reaction from the public about the quality that Zhang Dejiang has been speaking about at this year's session?
Well, the top legislature has been busy during the past year as it has deliberated 15 bills and draft decisions and passed 10 of them. And it has revised 21 laws and regulations and enacted 2 new laws, namely the tourism law, which aims to better protect the legitimate rights and interests of the tourists, as well as the special equipment safety law. And one of the highlights of the legislative work during the past year is the NPC Standing Committee has made significant revisions to the consumer rights law, which aims to better maintain the market order and to better protect the legitimate rights and interests of the consumers, especially online shoppers. There is a new item was included in the draft amendment that called for a 7-day period for the online shoppers to unconditionally return merchandise for refunds. And one of the another highlight of the legislative work is, as my colleague Han Bin mentioned in his story, is the legislation on the environmental protection law. And the top legislature has passed 3 reviews of the draft amendments and will deliberate it for the 4th time this year. Well, also a strong signal has been sent from the top legislature when NPC spokesperson Fu Ying briefed the media ahead of the 2 sessions. She said definitely amending the environmental protection law is on the top of his to-do list for 2014. And also last year, for the first time, environmental protection has been the NPC Standing Committee has stipulated that environmental protection is a basic state policy. So by amending the environmental protection law, we can definitely see that the top legislature is reacting to public concern. As last year from January, we have seen heavy smog shrouded the capital city and over 70% of the Chinese territory for quite a long time. So it's especially during this year's 2 sessions ahead of the political season. The heavy smog also have blanketed the capital city for at least 1 week. So definitely by amending the environmental protection law, the top legislature is answering public concerns. James.
So lots of rules and laws being passed by the NPC, but is there any kind of follow-up process where the NPC ensures that they are properly implemented, and how does it do that, if it does at all?
Well, we remember this morning in the top legislator Zhang Dejiang's work report, he has mentioned that actually past year's legislative work is a good beginning with the improved efficiency. Well, he described that as the first year of the NPC's 12 5-year term, he has not only inherited the legacy of his predecessor, but also adopted some new legislative methods. For example, the public used to be asked only once about a bill, and that's usually after the first reading of the bill. But ever since last year, the public was asked, the NPC Standing Committee has added one more round of opinion soliciting. So the public was asked for opinion about a bill after the second reading of the bill. So in this way, the top legislature have more interactiveness with the public, and at the same time, the Standing Committee has also invited experts and parties of interest to have discussions with the lawmakers, and this way the lawmakers can enact better laws. But of course, after this morning's report, I talked to some of the lawmakers. There are things that needs to be improved. Well, although the top legislature is doing a good job in the legislation work, as the public illegal awareness increases, there is an increasing demand for the top legislature to explain the laws and regulations. Well, many lawmakers say that explaining the Constitution and laws are as important as legislation itself. And also, some lawmakers say that the Standing Committee should put more funding and education to inexperienced and grassroots deputies. So in this way, they can better get involved in the legal process. So definitely, the top legislature is doing a good job during the past year. And also, there are things that needs to be improved in this year's legislative work. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Now joining us there from the Great Hall, the people. That's it from me. But Zoe, I know you have much more, especially here in the studio with your guests.
Thank you so much, James. We're going to talk about what the challenges the legislators are facing 60 years after the institution was established. And joining me in the studio, Professor He Jiahong from Criminal Law Research Center of Renmin University, and Mr. Edward Lehman, Managing Director of Lehman, Lee & Xu. Well, thanks for joining us. As I just said, the NPC was established 60 years ago. And 3 years ago, the top legislator then, Wu Bangguo, said that what they call socialist legal system was established. How do you look at the institution over the past 6 decades?
I think now we are talking about the history of the legal system in China. After the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, there were a few years we tried our best to establish a legal system with our special characteristics, but in fact we learned basically from the system in former Soviet Union. In 1954, we had the first constitution. It was a landmark of progress. But then since 1957 until the end of the Cultural Revolution, it was going back. That, at the time there was no laws. And then since the late 1970s, we started to restore the legal system. So in past 30 plus years, we have established the legal system, as we say, that's with Chinese characteristics. But in my opinion, we basically established that system on paper. So we have the laws, but the challenge is how to implement those laws existing already. So this is a more difficult job, not just for the legislature, but for the whole nation.
But as you said, it is the legislature's work to enact, amend, or appeal any laws. If all the set of laws are there, so basically their job is almost complete.
But you know that in China, the National People's Congress is not just a legislative body. It is the supreme power of the state. So it has the function to supervise the government, the Supreme People's Court, the Supreme People's Procuratorate. In other words, they would supervise the implementation of the laws. You know, for the working report made the chairperson, I don't think it's very special. You know, it's just talk about what they did last year and what they will do this year. Anyway, you know, it was just the first year for the new Congress. But I do see something, I would use the term, it's quite realistic, because he admitted, you know, the problem they were facing, the difficulties they were facing. For example, he mentioned, you know, the importance of the quality of legislation and the implementation of the existing laws and the effective of the supervision of enforcing the laws.
Mr. Lehman, you are a law expert. How do you look at the lawmaker's job here in China?
Well, you know, it harkens back to what Otto von Bismarck said. There's two things you don't want to see made, sausage and law. So I think it's a very difficult thing when one makes law. They're written, these are laws, policies, and regulations that have really good spirit and are moving in the right direction. But when you're implementing them, it's kind of like turning a ship around. You've got to move forward and then somehow try to change people's attitudes on how to implement these laws. So it's not just the top that says that these are the laws, but it's also how do we change people's thoughts and mentalities once these laws are implemented. So, for example, on November 15, 2013, they abolished the re-education through labor system. But then there hasn't been a real explanation on what is to replace that exactly. And that was perceived by people who have been around here recently as something not so, that's something that's totally bad, but it wasn't really necessarily bad.
Does it have to do with what is mentioned in the report of the Standing Committee, the quality of legislation? It doesn't specify the law enough.
Right, and that's the problem. I think that, as Professor Ho said, that we first were adopting in 1954 with the Constitution. It was a Soviet-style system. The laws, policies, and regulations are really modeled on the German Code of 1896 in law and science. Are not necessarily, they go together. Germans are very scientific, and then we've adopted this kind of law. So how does one implement that? As a government official, as an administrator, the problem is they don't get any extra money for implementing these laws. They don't get any benefits for implementing these laws, and so it becomes very difficult. So we have to look to judicial interpretations by the Supreme Court, but then still there's this lag time from the time the laws are written to the time they're actually implemented. And then again, the public perception on how to go forward with these laws is important. But I think these are clear signals. Environmental law, environmental protection, I think allowing for two children, for those that are single children themselves that are parents, I think it's all moving in the right direction. It's just everyone needs further clarification. And again, no one gets any extra benefit for actually going forward and implementing these laws.
And another direction the NPC has been mentioning is that they will provide legislations in areas that is livelihood-related issues. What exactly does that entail?
I think that also shows the development of the legislation. You know, at the beginning, when we restore the legal system, we have to have the most important department of the law, like Constitution, criminal law, criminal procedure law,
fundamentals.
Right. But now we have those laws there. Now we have to put our efforts on more detailed, specific part. When you're talking about those laws relating to the livelihood of the people, so next, in fact, that's this year, the legislature would do something like food security law, and also he mentioned that environmental protection law. And also another important law I would like to mention is administrative procedure law, because it's guarantee citizens' right to sue the government. It's also very important.
Direct answer to many popular calls for better health, and better quality of life.
No, and having worked with a Chinese law firm for 22 years and been here 27 years looking at this, another thing that just was recently passed or implemented, promulgated, was on March 1st, was the streamlining administration of opening up companies. So no longer do we have to have paid-in capital for that. And so I think what they're trying to do is increase the economic and livelihood. This also has to do with people who want to set up companies, who want to be a part of the system to pay taxes. They're going to streamline that, and then the administration is free to actually do other things as opposed to trying to implement how to set up a company. So that the annual reporting is going to be abolished, and it's going to be an annual reporting that will be done.
We're going to talk about that because the deepening of reforms, what we call, that will be carried out in the legal framework. That's something what we're just talking about. You're now watching Voices and Votes here on CCTV News, and our program will be back.
New faces and new vision at the annual NPC and CPPCC meetings. China is to navigate its own course. Legislators and advisors will discuss China's growth and debate allegations of the China threat. They will deliberate issues of both economic liberalization and social justice, only on Voices and Votes.
Well, the job of a lawmaker is, of course, to make laws. But how is it done here in China? Our reporter Hou Na takes us through the process of one NPC deputy.
Lawmaker Liu Kuan-ren considers himself well prepared for the annual session. Last year, the three-term political advisor was elected as an NPC deputy, and he's ready for the challenge.
Fulfilling my duty as a lawmaker is quite different from being a political advisor. An NPC motion becomes legally binding when adopted. I feel greater responsibility in taking part in the legislative work and making the law closer to the people.
Some 3,000 NPC deputies like Liu were elected last year for a 5-year term, while unlike Western lawmakers, Chinese legislators hold another full-time job working across the country at various sectors. Such a level of diversity has offered the lawmakers a considerable insight into China's national conditions and public opinions. Compared with previous years, the lineup of this Congress includes more farmers and workers turned lawmakers. Deputies to county and township level people's congresses are directly elected, while deputies above county level are elected by deputies at the next lower level. According to official figures, authorities received some 7,500 suggestions following last year's 2 sessions. Liu is the director of the Shanxi Cultural Bureau. This year, his suggestions will focus on increasing the funding for cultural sectors in his region of China.
I got the feeling that the government has been paying more and more attention to cultural sectors. That message was quite clear from the Premier's government work report. But I still think the government should put more funds and personnel into developing the cultural sectors in the northwest region, where the economy is underdeveloped.
Lawmakers play a key role in formulating major decisions and supervising the national organs of state power. They also present motions and suggestions on public concerns. Authorities have responded to about 90% of suggestions and motions presented by legislators last year, and the majority of problems raised were solved. Liu knows that identifying public concerns and making suggestions is just the beginning. And even when a motion is made law, there is a long way to go before the problem is solved. Hou Na, CCTV, Beijing.
So that's the process of lawmaking here in China through the IR1, National People's Congress deputy. Well, there are more than 2,900 of them. The quality of legislation has a lot to do with the quality of the legislators here in China. According to top legislator Zhang Dejiang, a total of 51 entries in 169 motions last year were put forward by NPC deputies. Are you happy with the number? More important, are you happy with the quality of their lawmaking?
No. I think we still have a long distance to meet the requirement of rule of law for the legislation. As you mentioned, that very important is the members of a legislature. In China, as you mentioned, we have more than 2,000 members of National People's Congress. They would vote for approving the legislation, but the law is basically drafted by other bodies. Some commissions under the Standing Committee of National People's Congress. I think for the legislation, it is very specialized professional work. So we should promote the specialization and the professionalization of the legislative work. So as members of National People's Congress and or as members of the People's Congress, they should have the specialties.
It is not realistic to let all the 2,900 National People's Congress deputies to be professional in lawmaking. And they're not full-time lawmakers. They have their own jobs.
Yeah, so in my opinion, that more important is to have the specialized experts in the Standing Committee of National People's Congress. Because for the members of the Congress, they would gather once a year to vote. But more important work for the legislation is before that. Who would draft the laws? Who would give the approval for submitting the draft to the National People's Congress? Of course, you know that some special committee, like the Legislative Work Committee, under the Standing Commission of the National People's Congress, would invite experts, law professors, to deliberate about the draft, and also experts from different departments to draft a law. But it is not enough. I think we should have more experts in the Standing Committee. I don't know exactly. I think we have more than 200 permanent members of the Standing Committee, and probably many of them are semi-retired high-ranking public officials. So they may not be experts in legislation or in the field of law. And another thing is, we mentioned the importance of implementation of the existing laws. But for making laws, you have to consider the enforceability or implementation of the rules. I remember some 20 years ago when I was studying in the United States.
That also needs professional knowledge and legal practice.
Yeah. What is your emphasis? I heard the discussion about the relationship of forest and the trees. For the whole system, you will see that's a forest. But for the individual rules, that's a trees. We should give priority to the forest or to the trees. In my opinion, we should give priority to the trees. We planted the trees, we'll make the trees alive. For example, in 1979, in our criminal procedure law, we had a provision clearly all tortures to obtain confession is forbidden, is prohibited. But that's just the rule there, just like a slogan, because there is no exclusionary rules against the illegally obtained evidence, no detailed rule to implement. So it's just a hollow slogan there. It's just like a tree with die.
Well, let's talk about the enforceability of laws here in China. There are many cases like Mr. He just mentioned. Another example is what we call visit parents law or regulation. You should visit your parents regularly, each kid in the family. What do you mean by frequently? And what if not, they don't visit their parents regularly? They don't have specific clauses in the law.
No, that's exactly right. It's interesting because I think that law comes from the Constitution. In the Constitution it says that parents must take care of their children, and children, when they become adults, they must take care of their elderly parents. So I understand the thought process and the thinking behind it, and I also think it's part of the Chinese culture as well. But you're absolutely correct, and I think Professor He and I have discussed this before on CCTV, which is how does one implement that? That's almost impossible to implement, and I would almost like to see it.
But why the lawmakers leave the term so vague, and there's much room for interpretation and enforcement?
Right. I think that that's a question of whether you're going to be proactive, like Professor He was talking about, or being reactive. I think to a certain extent this is a reactive kind of legislation, which is saying there have been problems since people have been able to travel, since the children have gone abroad and do other things, live in different cities. The world has changed in the last 20 years here in China. So they've done this as a reaction, I think, and not being proactive on how are we going to actually implement that. And I think it's important when they write the laws, policies, and regulations that they actually are proactive. They see the forest, like Professor He was saying, except not the trees. I think this is an example of the tree where they're trying to do something very, very good, but it's almost impossible to regulate that.
In that case, the law lost its credibility because nobody enforced the law. It's not enforceable.
Yeah, I think first, this should not be the issue to be regulated by the law. I think it should be a moral standard. Another thing is it is easy for the legislator to use very general terms. If they use very detailed, accurate, sometimes it may not be suitable, in specific situations. So this is also assessment of the level of quality of legislation.
But there are also some good signs, of course. The scrapping of the re-education through labor system is one major milestone in the legislature's report card. What does it mean for China's legal system to have the legislators say, well, this is over?
I think this shows progress we have made in past 30 or even 50 years. I talked to Lehman, that last December, when I was teaching at Taiwan University, I was invited to participate in international conference about the re-education through labor, how to abolish it. I told them just one thing, the original purpose for the rule or for the regulation was not that bad. But we didn't make very good provisions or rules about that purpose. So there are a lot of loopholes. Police may abuse power, local leaders may abuse power. So that's why we have to abolish it.
You're saying the law was not that bad,
the
but
purpose,
it was abused
because,
in some
because
way.
there was a specific reason for us to have that. In Chinese culture, we would think if you say someone just steal $100 and say that's a crime, is too serious, and it is not good for the re-education of that young guys. So we say just send him to a kind of labor camp. But there are loopholes. Some local leader may abuse power to use it with other purposes because there was no judicial review, there was no due process. But the original purpose was not just to give police power, to put somebody into custody.
But you still consider the abolition of this system a major progress in China's legislation?
Yes, that's why but we still need some other rules, other laws to fix the loopholes there.
Right. What we don't have, I think, since it's been abolished, then what's to take its place? Do you hold someone for 15 days? You hold them for a certain period of time? So this is where the gaps are, and this is where I think folks have a tough time as government officials. How do we implement this system? I agree there were abuses, but they need to figure out how to implement the system, and that it started as a good thing, but it got abused.
We've been talking about the Chinese National People's Congress work over the past years. Well, this institution vows to strengthen supervision to ensure implementation of policies and laws and achieving the year's task for economic and social development. That's also part of their agenda. As our reporter Han Bin finds out, many NPC deputies say the government's spending should be more transparent, and the boundaries of government power must be defined by the government itself. Not by the government itself, but by the law.
March in Beijing. Thousands of out-of-town lawmakers have gathered in the capital for the annual full session of the National People's Congress. Shangguan Jiqing is from northwestern Shanxi province. Reviewing the government work report and making suggestions are the basic forms of supervision by the deputies.
The fiscal budget decides the government's priorities. It's crucially important for the NPC to exercise responsible supervision that can influence the government choices and functions during reforms.
Shangguan says fiscal planning calls for increasing the agriculture budget by 8.4% this year. He says this is in line with the new policies released by the work report to continue preferential policies to the Western and developed regions. Shangguan has taken part in other forms of the NPC supervision. He's gone on several inspections in law enforcement, listened to key project reports, and was invited to attend a National People's Congress Standing Committee meeting.
China's constitution grants the National People's Congress the highest power of oversight, but it's also been criticized as being a rubber stamp. So many think the NPC needs to exercise its power, as well as explore new ways of being more effective in supervision on the issues of major public concern.
宪法第10条
Deputy Cai Jiming says what's needed is a mechanism and the resources to back it.
All of the NPC deputies hold 2 or more posts concurrently and have little time to do the real job of supervising. The limited numbers of law enforcement inspections can only find some of the problems, and most deputies have not been directly talking with or listening to the people.
Shang Guanjiqing and many other deputies say while feedback on their suggestions is crucial, what's really important is implementation and how it's done. They say great progress has been made, but there's still much room for improvement to strengthen the pillars of NPC oversight. Han Bin, CCTV.
Well, the rapid rise of China's social media has provided citizens a channel to discuss controversial issues more openly and even expose wrongdoings. Unfortunately, social media is also a place where vicious gossip and dangerous rumors are spread around like wildfire. Well, which brings us to the question we asked on our Sina Weibo: is social media a reliable source of information, and can it play a serious role as a watchdog over civil society? Well, one respondent wrote that social media allows people to express their personal views more freely, but all facts needed to be checked, confirmed, and not blindly assumed to be correct. Some people argue that comments on Weibo should only be taken as a reference because they don't always represent widespread public opinion. Another respondent said she didn't care if Weibo was a platform for solving social issues. It allowed her to voice her views and she wouldn't keep silent. Another writer said that people have to review and judge the content of all types of information they receive. He said, a true democracy needs freedom of speech, but China's social media needs rules that encourage people to speak freely. Well, to talk about China's supervision from the legislature, from the political consultative conference, from the public, we're now joined in the studio again Professor He Jiahong from Criminal Law Research Center from Renmin University, and Victor Gao, Director of China National Association of International Studies. Well, through the internet, a lot of people can get information and also air their grievances. There are a lot of information flow on the internet. That also poses a challenge to the legislature and the judiciary. What do you think the role of the internet in information and in justice?
I think everything has good side and bad side. You know, for the social media, it provided a lot of positive energy to prove, you know, the legal system, the practice of law, or all the affairs in our social lives. But there are some negative, you know, part for that. You know, the rumors would be not easy to prove, and some of them just based on their expectations. So I think that first, you know, the social media can gather public opinion, and this will once to get attention of the public officials and also push forward the efforts for the public official to solve the problem. But those information must be served just as a reference. I just give you an example, you know. For example, the Supreme People's Procuratorate would handle cases, we call it, that's occupational crime by public officials, like taking bribe or corruption. But a lot of information would come from the internet, but the prosecutors or the investigators would have to check the sources of the information. And to tell you the truth,
because of the source are anonymous.
Yeah. And sometimes they may give you a real name, but you still need to check. Yeah, but for some of the things, it's easy to check. For example, they would say, you know, someone has a lot of apartments, a lot of houses. That's easy to check. But for other parts of property, which may not be so easy to check. So I think overall, only a small part of the information, no matter it's a complaint or petition from the internet, would settled as a basis for a case starting investigation.
But you don't argue against that the internet has provided a channel for the people to air their grievances.
Yeah. I think
otherwise they wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah. So I think this is very important for Chinese people now. They need that channel to express their ideas, whatever it's good or bad.
Victor, how do you weigh in the pros and cons of this?
Well, philosophically, I would say Internet is a double-edged sword. If it is used properly for good purposes, it can actually speed up the dissemination and create efficiency and productivity significantly. However, we also need to fully acknowledge the fact that if Internet is used for inappropriate purposes or even illegal purposes or destructive purposes, it could actually do a lot of damage. And for example, Internet can be misused or abused to disseminate false and wrong information, to destroy reputation at a split of a second, and to create chaos or even havoc among the people by spreading rumors about earthquake, for example, false earthquake, etc. And as we can see in many other countries, the Internet can be used for overthrowing governments, for example, create social instability, etc. So I think we need to be very, very balanced in looking at both the liberating and emancipating power of Internet and put that to good use for the benefit of the people. But on the other hand, I think we need to be very, very careful about all the risks involved in Internet, especially the possibility of Internet being misused and abused by people with ulterior agendas.
Of course, the Internet or social networking tools is just giving the people another perspective, another way to look at how the government has been doing its job. We've been talking about the supervision here at this program. Supervision can come from the government itself, from the legislature, from the political consultative conference, and from the judiciary, and also from the public. It seems that it is everybody's business. Then there comes the question, if it is everybody's business, it's nobody's business. Yeah. So where should the major responsibility holders of this supervision?
I think that first, of course, the National People's Congress, because that's a supreme power in the state, and one of the basic function or power of that body was to supervise the implementation of the laws, all the rules passed by them, and all the activities of the public officials. You know, now we are working toward the rule of law, and the most important spirit of rule of law is how to restrain the use of the power by public officials. I think one way is maybe experienced, in other countries. We have to separate the power, the separation of powers, and try to make checks and balances. Although our political system is very different from that in the United States, but under the National People's Congress, we do have the State Council, the Supreme People's Court, and the Supreme People's Procuratorate. How to make more effective checks against each other, and that's a very important way to supervise the implementation of the rules.
I think one assumption is that the legislature hasn't done a very critical work of the government. Not enough questions have been asked, not very critical judgments has been made on the government's work. What do you think the legislature should do to improve the check and balance power?
I think that first we have to see the membership of the National People's Congress. I don't know exactly numbers, but I guess that the majority of them are public officials. You know, the ministers, the governors of the provinces, the mayors.
The 40% are actually government itself.
Or even more, I think that if we do have the principle of separation of the powers, they should not serve as members, or not that much public officials should serve as members of the People's Congress. Then the checks may be real and more substantive.
Because a supervisor cannot supervise itself.
Right.
Well, I would say if we look at the Chinese system as it is, in theory, it should be a very fine, well-established system. At the very top, you have the National People's Congress, which is supposed to be the supreme organ of state power in China. It actually has a supervisory role for the State Council, as you mentioned, for the Supreme People's Court and for the Supreme People's Prosecutors. In reality, it's much more complicated than that, mainly because, as we mentioned, lots of delegates to the National People's Congress are themselves government officials. They are party members. They listen to the ruling party, for example. And, for example, if you are a vice mayor and you are also a delegate to the National People's Congress, but the chairman of the provincial People's Congress is the party secretary of the province or of the city, whom checks whom? There is no balance to be made. Of
there
course,
is conflict of interest.
There is a conflict of interest because the chairman of the People's Congress is my boss in the government side or on the party line, for example. So I would say the checks and balance exist in theory, in concept, but in reality it does not work as we originally wanted them to work. So I think eventually power unchecked will breed corruption. And we need to build in sufficient checks and balances to make sure nobody in a position of power can abuse his power and enrich himself at the cost of the public interest.
So there should be some institutional reform in terms of the composition of NPC. For more talks on this, let's bring in some overseas perspective. Professor Gustav Gerard from Brussels. He is the director of Brussels Institute of Contemporary China Studies. Well, Gustav, I presume you've been listening to our talks here. China has developed a very unique political system. The National People's Congress serves as the nation's legislature, the top power organ, and there isn't separation of power here in China, but it is a kind of an institutional design to check and balance the government. What do you think of the political institution here in China?
Yeah, of course, it's, as you say, it's a quite unique system, and it's very different from the kind of liberal democracy we have here in the West. And it's quite obvious that it has a very important role to play, as it approves of the laws, it approves of the budget, and also important personnel decisions. But of course, on the other hand, it's also a very large body. It's about 3,000 delegates. And yeah, in fact, the only ones directly elected are the very low levels. And I think that in due time will have to change, because as you were discussing, it's very important that the link with the people whose interests should be represented is becoming closer. And I also think that, you know, there are a lot of ideas in China going in that direction, so as to make more efficient, more effective the actual control of the institutions. And I think that is only a normal development, because I'm always a little bit hesitant to point any fingers, because also our institutions in the West are far from perfect. And that's why I think it's very important to increase the communication about our systems and to create platforms where we can exchange experiences and views.
Talking about communication, Gustav, can you name some of the maybe stereotypes or misconceptions of Europeans about China's political system, and what sort of misconceptions are there prevalent in Europe, and what would you advise them to do to have a better knowledge about what is going on here?
Yeah, you know, it's very obvious that when you look to another system through the eyes of your own system, that you tend to think that it's not good, and that's by and large a general opinion here in Europe. But of course, the major idea is that you have a one-party system with these very powerful leaders, that they you know, say what needs to happen, and that all the others follow suit. Yeah, everyone knowing China a little bit knows that this is not what actually happens, and also that in the past decades there have been very substantial changes, and there are still other changes going on. So I think it's very important that also people in Europe get more accurate information about these developments. And one institution we are thinking of is to establish a Brussels Academy for Sino-European Studies. And it would be a kind of institution that would work within the framework of the high-level peoples-to-peoples dialogue, and would have as a purpose to provide a platform for deep-going exchange between Chinese and Europeans.
What do you think of the Chinese people's political aspirations, and how do you think the Chinese will be more involved in the political decision-making in the future?
Yeah. I visit China many times, and over the past 17 years I've seen a clear evolution, which doesn't come as a surprise to me, because the Chinese society is becoming much more complex, more diversified. You also see a growing middle class, which is developing higher aspirations. And of course, there are also a number of problems affecting their quality of life, and it's normal that those people search for ways to influence the decision making, or at least to have an accountable government. And I see a lot of developments, the changing the relationship between NGOs and the government.
Thank you very much, Professor Gustav Geratz from Brussels. He is the director of Brussels Institute of Contemporary China Studies. You're now watching our special program, Voices and Votes, on China's annual political season. And now we come to the terror attacks. 1 week ago, we have seen the Kunming terrorist attack last Saturday. The scale of the attack and the brutality drew expressions and sympathies, and also condemnations from governments and people from all over the world. Well, China has vowed a crackdown on terrorist crimes and safeguard people's lives and security. But only punishing the perpetrators is not enough to solve the larger problem. Our reporter Tom Boer has the story.
An outpouring of grief. Crowds gathered at southwest China Yunnan's Kunming railway station on Friday night to mourn the victims killed in the terrorist attack Saturday a week ago. Chinese people traditionally mourn loved ones on the 7th day after a death.
These terrorists cannot take us down. We will work together and prove to them that we will not back down.
The violence resulted in 29 deaths and 143 people injured. China soon beefed up security in Kunming and other major cities across China following the attack. Security authorities arrested all the attackers 44 hours after the incident. The violence in Kunming came at a sensitive time, with political leaders in Beijing preparing for Wednesday's opening of the annual legislature. Deputies all rose and stood for silent tribute to those killed.
China will step up efforts to ensure social order. We are determined to crack down on terrorism. We are determined to keep our nation a safe place. We have condemned the horrible terrorist attack in Kunming on March the 1st, and we have offered our deepest condolences to the victims and their families. We're resolute to crack down on all crimes that desecrate our laws and threaten society.
There were a series of deadly terror attacks last year in China. These included a car crash in Tiananmen Square in Beijing last October and the attacks on a local police station in Batu County in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in November.
The general security situation in China is fine, but given the attacks in Beijing and Kunming, we have to realize that terrorist crimes have developed from a regional problem to a national one.
Li says the central government has been doing well on beefing up security, acting on the aftermath of an incident and hunting criminals. But China is facing much bigger challenges than before, as the problem seems to be spreading.
We need to change the way we think. We can't treat these like ordinary crimes. Punishment won't curb the problem, since most of the terrorist attackers are desperate, and they do not fear death. What counts are preventive actions against terrorism and relevant legislation that can give anti-terrorism authorities more legal power and support.
Frequent outbreaks of violence have brought little optimism to the current security situation in China. Investing all-out efforts to crush terrorists is not easy, while legislating against terrorism is far more challenging. As the annual parliamentary meetings are taking place right now, people are expecting more effective anti-terrorism measures and policies in the future. Tambo, CCTV, Beijing.
Well, when people think about terrorist targets, terror attacks, China doesn't immediately come to their mind. But the fact is, Chinese have increasingly become the target of terror attacks. And my colleague Zhong Shi joins me in the studio for more. Good evening, Zhong Shi.
Good evening, Zhou Yue.
So why don't we start with the terror threats facing China now?
Well, sure. Let me pull up a map here. This is northwest China, where the country borders Central Asia. Now, terrorist groups in southern and central Asia have been infiltrating into China through this region. China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which has a large Uyghur Muslim population, has been fighting the three evil forces, namely terrorism, separatism, and extremism. The bulk of the terrorist activities here are connected to a group called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. It has been branded a terrorist organization by the UN and is responsible for some of the deadliest terrorist attacks on Chinese soil. So, yeah.
Well, it is terrible and senseless. Loss of lives caused by those terror attacks shocked people all over this nation and around the world. But would you please walk us through some of the terrorist attacks that we've seen in recent years?
Sure. The latest occurred just over a week ago in southwest China's Kunming city. A group of knife-wielding attackers slashed randomly at crowds at Kunming railway station on March 1st, killing 29 people and injuring 143 others. It has yet to be officially determined which group was responsible. In October last year, Xinjiang separatists crashed a vehicle in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, killing 5 and injuring 40. In June, 16 knife-wielding religious extremists killed 24 people in Shanshan County of Xinjiang. Police shot dead 11 of the attackers and apprehended the other 5. And before that, in April, a violent confrontation between terrorists and authorities in Kashgar's Bachu County in Xinjiang left 15 community workers and police officers killed. 6 terrorists died and 8 other terrorists were captured. Back to you, Zhou Yue.
All right. Thank you so much, Zhong Shi, for your reporting on that. And to talk about China's security picture and anti-terrorism efforts, join us here are Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies, and Mr. Yang Mingjie is the Vice President of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Well, it seems there are a lot of security-related news over the past few weeks. There was the Kunming attacks. Last year there was the car crash in Tiananmen Square, and just Saturday there was a plane missing of Malaysian Airlines. They haven't ruled out the terror attack possibility. So what do you make of the security picture here in China? What China is now facing?
Well, a couple of points. One is that if you compare China with the United States, for example, overall terrorist attacks here are relatively low in number and low in intensity. On the other hand, I think terrorist attacks are on the rise over the years, so that's very alarming. Now, on the other hand, I would say most of the terrorist attacks in China are related to the terrorist groups in Xinjiang, mostly with Uyghur fighters. And these fighters, or their comrades actually, many of them are operating inside Afghanistan. Some of them have been fighting against the American troops and NATO troops, for example, and some of them have been captured by the American soldiers and been detained in Guantanamo prison. And they actually bring back to Xinjiang, to the rest of China, this extreme form of hate, xenophobia, and terrorist ideology. And I think these are mostly at almost all these terrorist attacks.
What triggered the rise of violent attacks in recent years? What is the tipping point here?
Well, I would say this group of people, they have several things in mind. On the surface, they want to achieve so-called independence of Xinjiang and establish in Xinjiang, what they call the East Turkmenistan. That's on the surface. But I think more fundamentally, they are related to the international terrorist groups. They advocate a very extreme form of ideology. They want to set up a pan-Islamic, super state stretching from the Atlantic all the way to the Philippines, for example. And I think this is the very extreme and very dangerous ideology underpinning the terrorist groups and terrorist attacks in China, which on the surface seem to demand independence of Xinjiang.
Mr. Yang, what do you make of the features of those terror attacks, and what do you think those terrorists want to accomplish with those attacks?
And for me, I think I agree with Ms. Gao's arguments that I think there are priorities for the terrorist group in China is as same as a worldwide jihad, what they call, what means they can call it, because of the flags happened in last year in Tiananmen Square and this year in Kunming Road Station. They use the jihad flag, but only one special in Kunming Railway Station flag is the independent signals of Turkestan. So I think the priority for the terrorists in China is a requirement maybe for worldwide jihad, which means they want to rule the whole world by their rules. But secondly, maybe they want to carry out the so-called independence flag. That is another reason. But I don't think the second one is as same important as the first one.
But it is very unrealistic for those movements to realize this target of independence. But why do they still continue to lash out at the common people?
Yeah. Now, I would say that in China, for example, we have more than 30 million Muslims. And most of these Muslim compatriots, they live very peacefully, great harmony with the rest of the nation. I personally know many of my friends who are Chinese Muslims, and we get along very well. We do not have any problem. We respect each other. So I would say the majority of the Chinese Muslim community are law-abiding people here, and they are not extremist in their ideology or in their way of life, for example. It is this very small group of people, especially the Uyghur extremists and terrorists, who not only want to bring the extreme ideology they have learned abroad back into China, but they really want to turn Xinjiang into the test ground, into the battleground. They want to push this extreme version of jihadism toward the east and bring Xinjiang into that particular fold of ideology. Therefore, I would say, on the one hand, I would argue that mankind and the international community, we are faced with this very dangerous international terrorist group, and we need to come up with a common denominator and common platform in dealing with them as they are. The world and the international community will not be better served if we divide ourselves. We need to call them terrorists, and we need to support each other in our campaign against this very dangerous type of terrorism.
And do you think the Chinese government is up to the task because of the increasing security threats? Has the Chinese government done enough? Is their institution enough to cope with the challenges?
In the philosophical sense, I would say terrorism will not win because they don't have the truth and they don't have the support of the people. And if they inflict, a loss of life to the population, if they inflict great damage and destruction of the property, and they put themselves on the other side of the people. So I think, philosophically speaking, and on the macro sense of the term, we should not fear terrorists or terrorism. But on the other hand, I think the Chinese government can do a better job in improving international cooperation. We need to talk to all the major countries, the international organizations, so that we will come up with a common denominator. I've been advocating that the world will need to come up with an international convention on anti-terrorism so that these groups cannot split the international community. They cannot say, okay, I'm conducting these activities in China, and the Americans, you do not call me a terrorist group, you call me freedom fighter, for example.
So we need to get this. If there is Western countries of double standards about naming terrorists, how can we expect international cooperation on that front?
I think that I want to add one point to Ms. Gau's arguments, that he says that maybe not only he, I think in recent months, some people thinking that China is facing much more serious terrorist attack. But I don't think so, because even before September 11th, China has experienced the same hard time with the terrorists. So that's why Shanghai Cooperation Organization established. The purpose for the organization is for anti the three evils. So by the end of the 1980s and 90s and 80s, we show that there are a lot of terrorist attacks happened in Xinjiang and in some Central Asia countries. So in recent months, it happened not only in Xinjiang but in some internal provinces like Kunming and Beijing. So that makes most Chinese people worry about terrorists, and the world thinking that maybe the terrorist threat for China is increasing. I don't think it's in fact.
And can we rely on international cooperation from Western countries to fight terror
rely on ourselves
if they are unwilling to call some terrorists?
Yes. First, we have to rely on ourselves. Second, we have to depend on the international cooperation. Because, as I mentioned, the terrorism is not only an internal affair, it's become an international or global movement. So that's why we have to cooperate not only the United States, but also Russia and Central Asia countries and other developing countries. So that's why international cooperation is not only means involved in the campaign of the United States or Western countries. So that's we have to make clear.
Okay, over the past decade, actually, China has boosted its counterterrorism capabilities, its own capabilities. A major has been through the joint military exercises conducted through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, framework under the name Peace Mission. China and Russia have acted as key players in these missions through although all 6 members of the SCO have all joined in. The first peace mission was held in 2003, one in Kazakhstan and the other one in China. Since then, 6 more peace missions have been held between 2005 and 2013. The 2010 edition was a joint anti-terrorism simulation, again conducted in Kazakhstan. It was the largest China-Russia joint exercise held outside either country up to the point. It was also the first time that China's People's Liberation Army Air Force had flown a cross-border mission. While the stated goal of the SCO peace mission is to fight the 3 evils, namely terrorism, extremism, and separatism. They've also helped the PLA improve its logistics, command and control, as well as develop sophisticated tactics and strengthen its anti-terror capabilities. And now, to have more talks on anti-terrorism efforts, especially international cooperation on that, we're now joined by Dmitry Kozyrev, political analyst at Russian news agency RIA Novosti, and also here Mr. Yang and Victor. Let me start with Mr. Yang. Let's follow up on our talks. The U.S. accelerated its withdrawal from Afghanistan, probably put out its troops from that country this year. What we talk about is the East Turkestan Islamic movement, and many other fundamentalist movements will remain active in this area. So what role do you think Afghanistan, 3 major neighbors, namely China, Russia, India, big powers, should play to combat terrorism in that part of the world? Mr. Yang?
I think that there are 3 tasks, at least for Russia and China, to do in the future for Afghanistan issues. The first one, as the regional major powers in this region, I think China and Russia will be continued their contribution and support for the peaceful process of reconstructing Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is, we don't think it will become a black hole for the organized crime and maybe for terrorists. So we will support the elections and political, economic and security reconstruction in Afghanistan, the first task. The second task, I think, for both China and Russia, we will support, because of our membership, state member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we will support the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to play much more important and constructive role in Afghanistan issues in the future. For example, like not only anti-terrorist but also anti-drugs traffic, because drugs have linkage with terrorists. The third task, I think, for us is that our two countries will cooperate and to enhance our bilateral cooperation. For example, like the sharing intelligence and how to exchange our information on terrorist attacks, something like that. So the three tasks I think we have to do for the future.
Mr. Kosyrev, if the Americans choose to pull out of Afghanistan, by the end of the year, it will leave a power vacuum in Afghanistan. What is Russia's plan, and how will Russia and China cooperate if there is a rise of terrorism?
Certainly Russia will just have to take part in any kind of military effort to secure at least its neighbors' interests against terrorism. But the main thing here and the main answer is I expect to be business. Russia and China, India and Iran and Pakistan too are all the nations that are more or less bordering Afghanistan, and they can and they should be Afghanistan's cherished business partners, make investments and make a fair and equitable business for the Afghans. The people in this country should know that dealing with these countries mentioned is their livelihood, so we should have plenty of support from the local population just because we are doing business together. That's a very important part of anti-terrorist strategy, because a gun will never accomplish everything.
Mr. Gao, do you agree by making business and improving the livelihood of the people there, maybe there is a better chance that the terrorism will be in decline?
Well, I would say after the withdrawal of the American and NATO troops from Afghanistan, there will be very likely a very bumpy period before the dust will settle, and Afghanistan will be at a critical moment as to which direction to turn, whether to greater chaos and a bloodshed, or whether eventually it will transit to a period of peace and development. And I think China and all the neighboring countries need to play a very constructive role to help Afghanistan as well as people in Afghanistan to embark on a road of national reconciliation, economic development, stability and peace. That will be a tough call though, but I think we should leave no stone unturned and go to the hilt in promoting peace and development and reconciliation in Afghanistan. Now, for the terrorists, I would say that we need to promote the signing of an international convention on anti-terrorism, and then I would say that China can also increase its cooperation not only with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization members, but also with countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, which actually have very important role to play. And many other Uyghur terrorists actually have spent some years in Turkey, for example. They sometimes get financial support from extreme groups based in Turkey and other European countries, etc. And they actually tell many Western countries that they are freedom fighters here in China, and they try to get their sympathy and support. Therefore, I think China needs to promote our own case and convince the countries in the West that we are actually faced with the same group of terrorists, and we really need to set up this united front in fighting against terrorism wherever they are and under whatever excuse they are, and this will really make sure that the world will benefit by standing together on the same platform against terrorism.
What actually unite those countries you just mentioned are the SCO, because the SCO member countries, they cover a territory probably 3/5 of Eurasia continent, and the SCO was established to cope with the security challenges in this part of the world. But of course, in recent years, has kind of developed into a political and economic alliance. So, Mr. Kosyrev, do you think SCO will play a more important role in anti-terror campaigns if the vacuum in Afghanistan is left out there?
Yes, certainly, certainly. And I have a couple of things to say about this, because there are opinions, at least here in Russia, that just policing terrorism is not enough. It's like curing the disease from the outside while it sits there inside the body. I remember a conference where 4 leading Russian experts from Central Asia tried to determine the biggest single threat coming to Russia, a potential threat, of course, from Central Asia. They tried to understand what is the root of all the problems, including terrorism. And the answer was unanimous. It's the decline of education in these territories. Of course, what is meant is mostly ex-Russian Central Asia, and the degradation of human material. And the logic here is that SCO and other partners of Central Asian countries should do more to improve, to help these nations to improve basic education, higher education, to develop culture. The reason here in logic is very simple. A terrorist is mostly, if it is a foot soldier of terrorism, is a desperate creature, not understanding the value of his own life, not to mention the other people's life. And education and culture gives them a chance to improve not just their material living, but improve their understanding of what life is for and what they do on this earth. Of course, you certainly cannot expect terrorism to be completely eliminated by education. It will just diminish the base from which the people are trying to find terrorists and especially suicide bombers and people like this. But it's certainly a very long-term policy which has to be pursued.
But with the political crisis in Ukraine and the standoff between Russia and Ukraine, will it give Russia more reasons to bolster its role with SCO countries, or less reasons to do that?
Ukraine, of course, distracts Russia from any kind of policy in the East, but at least Ukraine gives us a very valuable lesson. The problem here, like with the previous revolts in the Arab East, is with European mentality. Anyone who picks up a gun and says that he is a freedom fighter has a chance to find understanding with European public opinion, and then European governments will have to follow that opinion, even if they know quite well that what followed the efforts in the Middle East was a disaster, even if they know that in the Ukraine they also encountered a disaster. They let, in fact, the terrorists into power in Kiev, and now they are letting these terrorists to terrorize the eastern part of the country, to use weapons, to move troops around Ukraine. And this mentality of Europe has to be tackled. Of course, I am not trying to offer anything antagonistic in that case. Just we, the rest of the world, have to teach Europeans some lessons, saying that not everyone who is a fighter against the government is a nice person and freedom fighter. At the best, you can say that terrorists are hiding among such people and watching over their shoulder and using harmless and unarmed people as a living shield in their activities.
All right.
Anti-government revolts should not be supported by anyone in the world.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Kozyrev, and also thank you, Victor and Mr. Yang, for your take on this anti-terrorism efforts. Well, actually, terrorism has been around for hundreds of years, but since the start of the 21st century, it has been a dominant global concern, and no country in the world has been immune to this. Well, perhaps the most infamous incident came on September 11, 2001, when Islamist terrorist groups Al-Qaeda launched an attack against the United States, and 4 commercial planes hijacked and used to hit targets in New York and Washington, D.C. 3,000 people died. On the other side of the Atlantic, a powerful explosion set up by a suicide bomber ripped through a packed subway train in Moscow. Russia, during the morning rush hour in February 2004, Chechen separatists were blamed for the deaths of 42 and more than 100 wounded. The following year, 2005, on July the 7th, militants detonated 4 bombs in London's Tube, killing 52. Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for that attack, saying it was to protest Britain's support for the Iraq War. And just weeks later, on July the 23rd, 2005, an Islamist organization targeted the Egyptian resort city of Sharm el-Sheikh. 88 were killed, over 200 wounded by the blast. July the 22nd, 2011, the usually calm country of Norway was also struck by terror. Deadly bomb blast was set off outside the Prime Minister's office. A gunman opened fire at young adults attending a camp on Utøya Island. Total 92 people were killed in the deadliest attack in Norway, while the perpetrator was identified as a right Christian extremist. So all these figures, in fact, show that terror knows no national boundaries. It is an international effort to curb terrorism. But what do you make of the new development of terrorism in different parts of the world? It seems that the terror against America has been on decline, but the homegrown terrorism in different countries has been on the rise.
Yeah, first of all, I would say that we need to make a resolute effort to prevent terrorists from getting their hands on more and more dangerous and lethal instruments. For example, if they can get their hands on a dirty nuclear bomb, then they can do a lot of havoc to mankind. And I don't think they will hesitate for a second before they want to use such large and massive weapons to create a maximum amount of loss of life and destruction of property. So that requires increasing amount of international cooperation. That's number one. Number two is that this united global front against terrorism, so that we will call terrorism as terrorism, we will call terrorist attack as terrorist attack, we will not do double standard, and we will not do hypocrisy in fighting against terrorism. This will leave terrorists and terrorist groups completely exposed, and then this will really enhance the efficiency and the efficacy of fight against terrorism. I think we should reach that level of international cooperation as quickly as possible, and mankind can benefit hugely by having a united international common front against terrorism.
We understand that after 9/11, the United States immediately asked this Congress to pass a legislation on anti-terror. So do you think it is time for China to do the same thing, to pass the law on anti-terrorism?
I think it's urgent for China to make up legislation for the anti-terror law or something like that. But I don't think it's so easy, because some people said we need a very urgent timetable. But I think we are so serious on that question. So that's why in the People's Congress and some people related to the legislation process said maybe we will make some harsh work to do the anti-terror law. But anti-terror law is a comprehensive law. It's not only related to the criminal law, but also to some companies law and money laundering and even some other law. So it's a framework. We have to make a timetable, but we have to be very careful. We have to, but for me, I think the anti-terror law is not only to give the definition of the terror criminal, but also give some principle and policy for the coordination of different agencies or ministries in charge of the anti-terror work. And also we give some recommendation from the law's view how the different departments or even the ordinary people can do involved in the anti-terror campaign. So that's a legal system. It's not only a very narrow legal law.
And on the government side, there is a new institution established this year. That's the National Security Commission, headed by President Xi Jinping himself. Is this something that will deal with external as well as internal security, will be up to the job of fighting against terrorism?
Well, I would say even in the United States, anti-terrorism is one of the most important tasks for the National Security Council, for example. And in China, when China has formally set up this National Security Commission or Council, it should target against enemies both foreign as well as abroad. Now, for terrorists, even though sometimes they are domestic terrorists, but their funding, for example, their ideology, their spiritual support, etc., may actually come from beyond the national border here. So it's both domestic enemy as well as a foreign enemy, and I think this will be one of the most important tasks in front of the newly established National Security Council in China. And I think people will support that, because every time when a terrorist attack happens, it really shakes up the population, but also it arouses the people to the higher level of movement and mobilization against terrorism.
Another thing is about intelligence, but since the Edward Snowden case was unveiled, there was a debate over security and privacy. How to maintain the balance, not step over the line of protecting people's liberty and also ensuring national security.
I would say if we really look at the revelation of Edward Snowden, I think most of the people in the world will be sympathetic to the Americans if, for example, they use a lot of this high-tech technology and instrument to fight against terrorism. The problem is that they actually overstep. They not only use some of the data to fight against terrorism, but they also use that for other purposes. And some of the purposes may not be legitimate. That's the problem. So I would say that if, for example, we have an international protocol of gathering information for the sole purpose of fighting against terrorism wherever they are, people will support that.
So maybe an anti-terrorism law should also cover an aspect on the protocols of intelligence gathering.
Yes, I think it is related to how to collect the information. But as you mentioned, I don't think Snowden's case just shows the privacy and the anti-terrorist balance. It shows how to make balance, not balance, but how to restrain one country foreign policy. For example, this case, United States, it not only want to protect the privacy, but it want to penetrate other countries' sovereignty. That is another problem.
Okay. We have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're running out of time here. Before we go, let's turn to my colleague, James, for more on the security preparations for this year's Parliament session. There is some gadgets and also equipment that is installed.
Well, of course, each day on these Voices and Vote special, we try to bring a picture to everyone at home to somehow capture the spirit of what's happening here outside the studio in Beijing. Thanks so much. So, yeah, as Joey just said, security officers on alert on every corner of Tiananmen Square, and so are some of man's best friends. Security dogs are being deployed on patrol during this major political season. They do what their human partners can't, which is sniffing and identifying suspected explosives in cars, garbage cans, and even carpets within the main meeting halls. They nap, they eat, they even take a bath on the pavements on the side of the streets. That's some dedication to the job, Zoya. I don't think we're anywhere committed as that.
Well, you have a canine companion to do a security job is always a plus. Well, thank you very much, James. So that is the picture for today. We have been talking about the legislature's work. It has taken 6 decades for China to get here, to build a sound modern legal system. And that system is still a work in progress, as is the country. Legislators are now better trained and equipped to do the job, but of course they need to ask more of the government and hear more from the people. And I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.